Hi everyone, I am Shumpei Goke. I'm a former PhD student in economics at Stanford who just graduated last month. I'm pleased to present my work, Bidders' Responses to Auction Format Change in Internet Display Advertising Auctions, which is a joint work with Gabriel Weintraub at Stanford GSP, Ralph Mastromonaco at Barrow Bank, and Sam Seljan at Zander. Let me start with the motivation. There's an extensive theoretical literature in auctions regarding bidders' equilibrium behavior under different formats, starting from the seminal work by Bikri 1961. And this is not just of theoretical importance. It is crucial for market designers to understand bidders' behavior under different formats. Most notably, there's a debate between first price auctions versus second price auctions in the market of sponsored advertising and display advertising. In the academic literature, there's a lot of lab experiment study that report a suboptimal behavior by bidders as surveyed by Kagel and Levin in 2016, but there are very few field studies about how bidders learn to bid in auctions. One notable exception is by Drozelsky, Lewis, and Pix in 2018. In this work, we present one of the first field studies that analyze bidders' response to auction format change by focusing on the switch from second price auctions to first price auctions in the display advertising market. The research question is twofold. First, how quickly do bidders learn to bid in a new environment? And second, how do different bidders react to the format change? Before jumping to the research question, let me explain the institutional details. So these auctions start by the internet user visiting a website. Now, every time an internet user visits a website, there's an auction to determine which ad content is going to be served for like one auction per ad space. And when the user visits a website, the website, which is called the publisher, sends an ad request to the ad exchange, which administers this auction. And the publisher acts as the seller in this auction. There are a set of advertisers on the right side. These advertisers typically retain intermediaries called DSPs or demand-side platforms, which act as bidders in this auction. Now, these DSPs submit bids based on the information from the advertisers. When the bids are turned in, the ad exchange declares the winner, processes the payment, and shows the ad content to the internet user. I'd like to introduce one terminology, which is impression. Each instance of loading one ad space is called an impression, and in general, there is one impression, one auction. So suppose you visit a website which has 3 ad spaces. Then every time you load the page, there are 3 impressions, 3 auctions to determine the ad content. With this in mind, let me explain the data and the auction format change. We use the auction data from AppNexus, which is now called Zander, and they were acquired by Microsoft last month. They run a major ad exchange, which we benefit from. We focus on 2 sets of publishers. The first set is what we call the global company, and the second set is the publishers of 3 European media companies. So there are 4 companies in total. Each of those companies own a lot of websites, and each of those websites is called a publisher. Now we have 8.5 years of data for the global company publishers, 3.5 years of data for European media companies. The dataset we use is aggregated at the daily level. On each day, we observe the revenue and the number of sold impressions for each publisher-bidder pair. About the format changes, the publishers of the global company switched from second price to first price auctions in 2 batches. The first batch is by what we call September publishers because they switched in the September of 2017, and the second batch by February publishers, which switched in the February of 2018. For the European media companies, there were 3 batches of format change and a set of publishers that did not switch, or non-adopters, so to speak. In the analysis part, we compare publishers that switched versus publishers that did not switch to first price auctions as treatment versus control group. And there are 4 sets of treatment control comparisons. The first set is within the global company, where the September publishers is a treatment group and the February publishers is a control group. The second set is the first batch of the European media companies contrasted with the remainder of the publishers of European media companies. The third and the fourth sets are the last two batches of the European media companies versus the non-adopters within the European media companies. So this chart shows all the treatment control comparisons. Let me explain the raw data. I'm showing you two weekly time series. One for the September publishers of the global company, the other for the February publishers of the global company. Now, the vertical axis is the revenue per sold impression, which is revenue for all these publishers bunched together divided by the number of sold impressions. What we see is a jump in the average price immediately upon format change. So the first vertical line indicates the date on which the September publishers changed the format. And we see a jump in the average price for the September publishers, but we don't see any corresponding change for the February publishers. Likewise, the second vertical line indicates the format change date for the February publishers. We see a jump for February publishers, but we don't see any corresponding change for the September publishers. So this is the observation from the raw data. In order to quantify the magnitude of this increase in the average price, we need an event study regression. This is the regression equation. On the left-hand side, so everything is indexed by P and T, the publisher and day. So we have one daily time series per publisher. The left-hand side variable YPT is revenue per impression that is sold to publisher P on date T. On the right side, we have two-way fixed effects. We have the treatment dummies interacted with the number of days from the treatment date, the event date. So the beta k's are coefficients of interest, which tells you what is the impact on the price of the format change k days after the auction format change. We have publisher-specific seasonality adjustments, which include month fixed effects, day-of-week fixed effects, day-of-month fixed effects, and end-of-quarter fixed effects. We have error term at the end. We have two identifying assumptions, the first being the heterogeneity of the treatment assignment, and the second is the parallel trends. As for the first assumption, we have anecdotal evidence to say that the auction format change date is determined randomly, in the sense that according to the people who handle this format change, the publishers also wanted to do an analysis of the impact of the format change. So they chose the format change date to be some date where there's a least chance of confounding by other factors. For the parallel trend assumption, we would defer this assumption, a discussion on the assumption, to the result part, where we look at the estimates of beta k's for negative k's. We weight the regression by the number of impressions sold, and we cluster the standard errors at the publisher level. Now let me explain the results for the global company. I'm showing you the estimates of the beta k's. The point estimates are in the solid line, and the 95% confidence intervals are shown in band. For the September publishers, we see a jump in the average price immediately upon the format change, like we see a jump here. And the magnitude is also significant. The estimate for beta 1, the impact one day after the format change, is 0.46, which is 75% of the average price for those publishers in the 30-day period immediately preceding the format change. For these publishers, we see that the coefficients are positive consistently after the format change. So we see that the price under the first price auctions remains higher than under the second price auctions. Now, how about the European media companies? We still see a jump in the average price, which is 35% of the average price, which is significant. But this time, this price increase dissipates over time. In other words, the price under the first price auctions returns to the same level as under the second price auctions in 2 months after the format change. How about the more recent format changes? For the set 3 and 4, we still see a jump, but this jump diminishes in approximately 30 days after the format change. So how should we interpret these results? So we offer two sets of two observations that are coherent with the results we see. First is suboptimal bidding followed by learning. In the last three format changes, we see that this increase in the average price dissipated over time. Now let's take a step back and imagine what would happen if all the bidders were rational. If all the bidders were rational, under the second price auctions, each bidder would bid the value of the impression to the bidder, while under the first price auctions, the bidder would shade the bid according to some Bayesian-Nash equilibrium strategy. So we would expect that the average price under the first price auction to stabilize at a level that's sustained by a Bayesian-Nash equilibrium. But what we see is a temporary increase, not a permanent increase in the price level. We interpret this temporary increase as evidence of suboptimal bidding, in particular, insufficient bid shading under the first price auctions by some bidders, followed by learning by bidders, where bidders learn to shade over time. So that's why we see a decline in the price. One notable fact is we see quote-unquote revenue equivalence in the sense that the price levels under the second price and the first price converge to each other. We believe this is interesting, and we think this is interesting because we don't necessarily believe this is a manifestation of the classical revenue equivalence theorem like Meyerson in 1981, because the assumptions for the classical theorem is very strong. They require things like bidder symmetry, which we don't necessarily believe is true in actual practice. The second observation we draw is long-term learning. If we look at more recent format changes and compare that with the past format changes, it took less time after the format change until price went down. We interpret this as evidence of long-term learning, where bidders get better as they experience format changes repeatedly. Now, one caveat is these two observations are just one possible explanation for the observed patterns in aggregated data. So we don't really see what bidders are actually doing. So we are just offering one explanation that's coherent and consistent with the observed patterns in the aggregate data. Now, let me explain some heterogeneity study. If the spike in the price is caused by suboptimal insufficient bid shading, then we would expect that sophisticated bidders shaded their bids more than unsophisticated bidders. In order to test this hypothesis, we rerun the analysis separating what we call Abnexus Zander bidder versus the rest. Abnexus Zander bidder is the set of advertisers that use the bidding algorithm provided by Abnexus or Zander. Crucially, this bidding algorithm has bid shading algorithm under the first price auctions. Whereas for the remainder of the bidders, we don't really know what those bidders are doing, what kind of algorithm they are using. So they may have some bid shading algorithm between. They may not have any bid shading. The result is very striking. So if we look at the spending by the Abnexus Zander bidder, it changes very little after the format change, while we see that there's a significant jump in the spending for the remainder of the bidders. We interpret this as evidence that Abnexus Zander bidder shaded the bid more, which suggests that the price increase in the main result may be caused by insufficient bid shading by unsophisticated bidders. Now, we have done several robustness checks and other checks. First, you may be wondering at this point, okay, so what is the role of ad campaign budgets? If say like, the bidders spend a fixed amount of budgets on the publishers, then like whatever we see doesn't really matter. But we have evidence that that is not the case. We have evidence that ad campaigns spend only a fraction of the budget on the tweeted publishers, so that we believe that the main results are caused by auction dynamics, not budgets. We have tried other specifications, like using log of y on the left-hand side in the regression. We have tried other seasonality adjustments, and we don't really see material difference in the results. We've tried falsification tests using hypothetical event dates, and we don't see anything similar to the main results, which is reassuring. To conclude, we have analyzed the response in the average price to the format change, specifically from second price to first price auctions in the display ad market. We see a temporary increase in the average price whose duration becomes shorter over time. And we eventually see quote-unquote revenue equivalence, which is interesting. We interpret this result as suggesting suboptimal bidding, in particular insufficient bid shading by some bidders, followed by learning. And we also see this as evidence of long-term learning as bidders repeatedly experience format changes. The heterogeneity analysis suggests that sophisticated bidders shaded more than unsophisticated bidders. We believe this is an important complement to the theoretical predictions, which are pretty active these days, based on reflecting the industry trend from second price to first price auctions. In future, we'd like to exploit some bid level data. We have bid level data for the auction format change in April of 2020, that's set 3. So we hope to see the bidder responses more clearly. Thank you.
Thank you. We have time for a couple of questions.
Thank you. That was very interesting. I was wondering, you mentioned in this kind of context, you wouldn't expect revenue equivalence. So I was wondering if you had some intuition for why you observed something like this.
So I couldn't hear the main part. So what do you want me to explain on? Sorry.
Yeah, I'm wondering that, from a theoretical perspective, you wouldn't necessarily expect revenue equivalence without an IID assumption. So do you have intuition for why you observe it in these settings?
Yeah. So yeah, thank you for the question. So like I mentioned, I believe the bidder symmetry is a very strong assumption, which doesn't necessarily hold in real practice. So like there is the paper about asymmetric auction, which says if bidders are asymmetric, we don't necessarily have the revenue equivalence. So we don't have strong prior about whether the price that in the long term the price level will be the same, but that in the data that's what we see.
On the virtual side. Yep, there are a lot of questions here.
Yeah, so thank you very much for the talk. I guess I have a multi-part question. I'd like to understand better the sophistication of the bidders, even the unsophisticated ones. So, for example, how much ahead of time did the bidders know regarding this format change? And then, do I understand it correctly that it's the DSPs bidding and not the actual advertisers? And maybe the third part of the question is, how significant is being unsophisticated for the bidders? Is this, do they have large budgets? Like, is this about millions of dollars for them, or is it per advertiser like a couple of $100? Yeah, so that's my question.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So I think for the first one, what we hear is like the format change has been announced like several months ahead of the actual format change. So and then that's in the second question. Yes, the DSPs, not the advertisers, were in charge of coming up with the bidding algorithm. So at least theoretically, the DSPs had some time to prepare for the format change. So for the third one, okay, so we don't really know like how sophisticated those videos, like those remainders of the videos were. So this publisher, the global company, especially for the global company, they like that is a really like a large publisher. So I don't have a number off the top of my head, but it's definitely more than several $100s for each bidder.